Most people build their careers in predictable lanes, but Jacqueline Ganim DeFalco has never been interested in predictable. While her peers were climbing traditional corporate ladders, she was pioneering business development frameworks for Ninex in the early 1980s. Then, jetting off to Beijing for international management training before most Americans could find China on a map. By the late 80s, she was managing director from Ninex's entire Asia Pacific region, building telecommunication empires from the ground up and developing what she calls marketing reconnaissance, a strategic approach that's become her signature method for uncovering opportunities that others miss entirely. After nearly 2 decades of breaking barriers in telecommunication giants like Ninex and GTE, Jacqueline made another unconventional move in 1998. She walked away from corporate security to launch Marketing Reckon, her own advisory practice. Armed with an MBA from New York University Stern and much more, and a track record of turning complex business propositions into market victories, she has since become the go to strategist for everyone from venture capital firms to emerging tech companies that need someone who can see around the corners. But perhaps most intriguingly, this woman, who spent her career connecting global business partners, also has built a parallel life as a jewelry artist, transforming Cape and sea glass into wearable art. Today, we are exploring what happens when you refuse to let conventional boundaries define your possibilities. Welcome, Jacqueline. I am super stoked to have you here. How are you doing?
Thank you so much, Helena. I'm doing really wonderfully on this beautiful summer we're having here now in New England. Thank you.
You're welcome here. I am thrilled and interested in what you have to share. We had our preparation conversation already, and I was so energized and inspired by your story. So I'm so happy and also proud that you bring it here for my audience on the Boundary Breakers Collective. What makes you a boundary breaker, or why do you consider yourself a boundary breaker?
So it's interesting. I think to a certain extent, anyone that falls into this category finds this very early on in life. It doesn't necessarily, it's not necessarily called a boundary breaker at that particular. Sometimes you almost feel like an outlier. It's really when you realize that you just aren't doing things the way everybody else does them. And for me, that goes all the way back to grade school. And I think part of it for me was growing up in a very entrepreneurial family where, every Sunday evening we sat down and looked at the company and what was going on. And that determined where we were going to go to school, how much money we were going to spend. I think there's a lot of things that go into that thinking when you're a child. So that's the very
Yeah.
beginning of it. It really starts there. And of course, a lot gets formed during your education as well. But I think friends, family, education, community all have a huge influence on what direction you're going to go in.
Absolutely. So, who has influenced you most when you were growing up?
Oh, it's a big story, but I have to start with my grandmother. And I know that certain things are predictable, but boy, grandparents can have a huge influence. And my
Mhm.
father's mother, who was born in Lebanon, came to this country very young, was a woman who really had to take charge early on in her life because my grandfather had a terrible accident. And so she had to all of a sudden come forward in really a culture where women didn't necessarily play the lead role in the family, especially from an earning standpoint. And not only did she go to work and just try to keep the family going alongside of my grandfather while he was dealing with things that he had to deal with, she also was the peacemaker and the one who kept the family together. And at the same time, you could find her with that apron in the kitchen. She was 4'9", by the way, which is very small. But boy, you put her in the kitchen, she was a powerhouse, and I used to follow her around. So she was a great female influence early on. And of course, my parents were phenomenal. They balanced each other out. My dad was an engineer. He's still alive, God bless him. And my mom, who's passed, had the creative mind, and they worked together in a family consulting practice, working predominantly for small municipalities, but ingrained a lot of that very traditional work ethic. It was a joke in high school because my wonderful professors in my very small private high school, who were the next big influence on me, would say, that's the Lebanese work ethic. But in this country, most people talk about the Protestant work ethic. So it was funny growing up in that environment and learning all that sort of discipline. But family first influence. And then to continue that story, I started probably just before I went to high school. One of the things that I think becomes really important, especially when you're the next sort of generation. I was not first generation here, but my parents were first in their families to have an education. And I think education was primary thinking, but also learning something outside of your formal education in the arts. So it was either ballet or piano or something. That was what we did when we were kids. We did one of those things. I think today kids try to do all of them, but we would do one of them. And for me, I really connected with this amazing woman from Scotland who my father met in his graduate program. And she was an actress in Scotland and became a speech therapist here in this country and did private drama coaching. I was just amazed by this woman. She had such presence, and I knew that I had to just be in her orbit somehow. So my father had me go every Saturday to these private lessons, and we would do very funny things like go off to nursing homes with the elderly and have to recite soliloquies from Shakespeare or Bernard Shaw. And believe me, if you want an audience to hear you, you have to speak to a group of elderly people. That's how you learn how to speak.
Yeah.
But she really pushed me. And she was probably outside of my family, my first true mentor. And then I think my father and my mother both felt so strongly that early education was critical. And I was very fortunate to go to a very small private high school run predominantly by Europeans, actually priests that had escaped the Hungarian Revolution, and started a European style education for gifted children in our little town or little city of Buffalo, New York. And it was very unusual. It had nothing to do with money to go to this school. It all had to do with potential. And I think that's one of the key things a lot of people miss in their kids. It's not like what you're performing in the school today, it's what your potential is. And most schools have too many boundaries. Speaking of boundaries, there were no boundaries in this school, which was called Calsanctius, named after St. Joseph Calsanctius, Galileo's peer. To put it in perspective, I think at that school, the headmaster took me under his wing. And so he was probably my next true mentor, again, pushing me, allowing me to do things differently because I was really actually unusual in that environment. So I think that going back to influences, people that see your potential and give you that push even when it's difficult. And those were the first ones. And then that story continues into my career as well.
Yeah, that's so interesting, Jacqueline, because with the story, and I would like to go to something that you told me before about your father's words in order to just be yourself and show up with all your potential. And not everybody has this background, this intercultural mix, this like first generation studied already, the combination of the more brains with artists mix. And we cannot change that because we cannot choose where we are born, but we can
Right.
change that for our children. We can
Right.
become very much aware of, even if we did not have certain opportunities or certain education or upbringing that really activated our potential, that we are not limited to say like that, and also parenting in that way. And I think that's a very important one for people that are listening and say, yeah, okay, but we didn't have parents that were like that, or we didn't have these
Yeah.
opportunities. You can create them for your children or for other people that you have an
Right.
impact on. I think that's a very important lesson, if I can call it like that.
Yes, I think a lot of biases are built into society. And I think my parents, who honestly just learned from the mistakes of what they saw around them as children, right? Like they picked up the
Mm.
things they knew they didn't want to happen. I give them so much credit, and I don't think they were even conscious of some of the advice they gave us. My dad was, I never was conscious that I was a woman or younger than anyone or smaller than someone because he would refuse to accept any of those excuses as a child. So going into the work world, when people were complaining about all the discrimination that can happen easily in the workplace, I just felt that I could rise above it with my skill set, with my skills. And I had to use that my entire career. It was always about what do you know? How do you communicate? How do you build relationships? Not, I'm a woman and I can't do that, or I'm too young and I can't do that. I didn't
Yeah.
have any of that clutter in my head going into my career, which I
Mm.
feel very fortunate about.
Yeah. Yeah, and to your point, a lot of us do have that because it was planted there from very young age. It was there. You cannot do that because you're a woman, or you have to do that because you're a girl, things like that. I was listening to Joe Dispenza, one
Mhm.
of his books this morning, and he said that children between age 2 and 5 are in theta wave, where they are basically their subconscious is open and it is
Mm,
not filtered. So they actually believe everything that you say, which is something that a lot of us are not aware of. And I'm talking
right.
about parents, educators, etc. That
Yeah.
means that every seed that you plant into their head stays there as a kind of reality, and we should be much more aware of that and keep our intentions in a way that is really activating potential instead of limiting, because we are getting limited in so many ways at all ages through so many systems that we are participating in willingly or unwillingly. So it is so important that we dare to reflect and see if this is still serving us, and to break boundaries. That's why
Yeah.
we are here. So did you consciously set out to break boundaries, or was it just something that happened? Tell us a little
Well,
bit
I
more about
think, yeah,
Jacqueline.
some of it is reacting to a specific environment. And I think when you're an independent thinker, which I always was from the time that I was a kid, and I think it's just because I grew up in this entrepreneurial family, and part of it is my nature, you you really have a lot of pushback from other kids, and you see this in every generation, right? So I had to actually always go up against that, and then I had to keep building my sort of inner strength along the way. And I think then you start to then consciously look for opportunities to do things differently. I think you really, when you see an opportunity, you have to jump on it. And then you look back, as I recently have with one of my former bosses from working in Asia. And he actually said, "You really were a pioneer." I said, "I never, I, to some extent, you feel that, but you don't at the time. You can't say, oh, I want to be a pioneer. That doesn't happen that way, right? But if you see an opportunity to do something different, you need to be ready for it. You need to
Mm,
have all your ducks in a row so that you can jump on those opportunities. And I think that's part of it, is setting realistic short-term goals for yourself as an individual. And it's just one of the, for me, it's one of the fundamental things that you have to learn so that you're ready for success and failure, which is building small. I always look at it like a staircase, right? You don't jump from the bottom to the top of the stairs. You do one step at a time. And so that way, if you fall, and we all fall along the way, you only fall back one step, and then you can pick yourself back up again. And so
yeah.
if you put your building blocks in place, which are family and community and education and work and training in different areas and disciplines, so that when those opportunities hit you, you can like actually go with those. You can get on the train and move with them. So I think having that stuff together helps you. There's a different school of thought, especially when you have these crazy wealthy entrepreneurs that have arisen in this country. through just jumping into the middle of the fray without any real thinking. You have to be exceptional for that. I don't
Yeah.
know that I never felt that I was so exceptional, but I also felt like I could, through discipline, get further ahead. How's that?
Yeah. I would say that you are exceptional, but a lot of people are exceptional. And so, for people who want to find out more about Jacqueline's career track, just check her on LinkedIn and you will see that she is exceptional. The thing is, and we will come to that in terms of formal education and knowledge and expertise. But when you look at how society and how systems and how life is set up today. So many things that we don't know, with so
Mm,
many unpredictable things. Sometimes it's really chaos. And when I was in finance recruitment quite some years ago, we were talking about budgeting, forecasting, long term planning, things like those
hmm
things seem like irrational right now in terms
mm,
of what can you plan in 5 years,
mm,
especially with the acceleration that we see now in evolutions. I'm not only
hmm
talking AI, but
Yeah.
so it is so difficult to predict things and to have all the facts and to know everything. And what I
Right.
see is that this creates a lot of anxiety and reluctance to make decisions. And for me, one of the things that I work with a lot with women leaders is also how to access, how to tap into your wisdom, how to
Mm,
tap into your intuition. I know that's a
mm,
word that we cannot use in boardrooms or in corporate meetings, but
mm.
yet it is about understanding and see the setting and the context in a different way, and then
Yes.
act upon it from a presence and a serenity, including leadership capacities that are rather new and that are very,
Mm,
I would say, feminine, because we do not know everything. We can have our ducks in a row in terms of our own values and our leadership strategy and our leadership vision. And
mm,
it is very important to develop that capacity. And I see a lot of anxiety and even burnout
mm.
because a lot of us don't have access to that, don't
Yeah.
have developed that. We all have it, we all can do it. We
Yeah.
just haven't developed it. How do you feel about that, Jacqueline? How do you see that?
I think that you have to, first of all, it's interesting you were talking about where do you go to calm yourself. I was a history and English major in college, in undergraduate. And that got me into the discipline of research in a way that a lot of people don't have an opportunity to experience. And I do think that being able to research the world around us, research opportunities, even research people that you want to get to know or whose stories are powerful that you want to emulate in some way, shape, or form, along with reading, along with writing. I think all of those things help center you and put a context around all the uncertainty that people are feeling, right? Because this uncertainty has happened before. I think the other side of it, though, is that being a kind of a, I'll say like a good scout, right? A Girl Scout, a Boy Scout, whatever your scout model is, but controlling the things that you can control is super important. And being exceptionally good at the things that you're good at is really important. And it helps you get rid of some of that clutter because we can't be good at everything. One of the things that I have noticed over the years in interviewing people for whether they were going to come to work for me or be involved in an organization that I was involved with is somebody that just says yeah, they can't even understand sort of their own weaknesses and strengths is generally not a good candidate. And so to be able to survive in almost any environment, you have to know the things that you're good at and always be working on the things that you're not good at. That it's part of a preparedness. I may not be answering your question directly, but I think if you are prepared for all these different scenarios, you're better off when it's an uncertain climate.
Yeah.
My own experience was like being sent to Asia with 24 hours notice. It wasn't that I just went to Asia to manage the Asia Pacific region. I had to decide on a Friday that I was going to start the job on Monday. and basically drop
So
everything.
tell us a little bit more about that, but because it was not only on a 24-hour notice, it was also doing something that you had never done before in a country that you didn't know, that talks a language that you didn't know. So how does one accept that and start there with in presence and having all the ducks in a row?
I think because you try to keep different parts of your life organized. Now, part of that was I had the flexibility because, first of all, like for example, I already owned my apartment in New York, so that gave me options. So even though I was very young, when I graduated from college, I said to myself, I'm never going to pay rent. I'm not paying rent in New York City. I'm not paying these ridiculous prices. So I saved and saved. I found roommate situations so I could just pay for a room in somebody's apartment. And so 2 years after college, I had enough for a down payment on an apartment in Manhattan.
Mm.
There was a bit that gave me flexibility because I could keep it and leave and keep somebody there and rent it out. So just basic things like that, right? Just having those kinds of things. Having already lived in that part of the world for 6 months to finish my MBA was helpful because became familiar with all these different organizations. And so what I did was I leveraged building a network, by the way, was key. And I'll talk about that forever. But I said, okay, when I went to live in China, I need to know everybody that I know that has a connection to mainland China. So there's all these great research organizations that were out of Washington, D.C. And I just kept asking people, who do you know that's been there? And before you knew it, I had access to some of the most fabulous people before I ever set a foot in that part of the world. So creating
Wow.
relationships as your basis for doing almost anything for me is fundamental to success and being able to just turn the key and move on to something new. So I always feel that I could be dropped into literally any part of the world or the country and already have a base. And I think you do that consciously.
Mm.
For me, it started very early. And then in college, I joined a national sorority, which was a big move for me, being somebody that's so independent. But I knew that I had access to that network, and you have access to your alumni networks through college and through graduate school and everywhere that you live. And so you just keep building. So I think that's another fundamental element of being able to turn the key. So it gives you the bait. It helps buoy you up. And then the other thing is your knowledge. And you have to
Mm.
have something that you're building your reputation on. So going to that part of the world for me, it was literally no one else in the company had even set foot in that part of the world. So just the fact that I had been there for my graduate work was already a leg up. And in fact, at the time, my mentor, who was the CFO of the company, when I was told that I could have this opportunity, he said, just do me one favor. Make sure I never have to get on a plane and go that far. So just come back and tell me everything I need to know. I don't ever want to have to go to that part of the world. There was a, there were building blocks, but that
Yeah.
that also came with the earlier decision that I made to go to school in Beijing in 1986 versus go to HEC in Versailles in France, which would have been a much more predictable experience, even had the language. So it was that really set the stage for me to have this opportunity. And it was that Beijing experience was very challenging, as you could well imagine. It was a one-way
Mm.
ticket for 6 months to go to a country that I'd never been to that was not very set up, let's put it that welcoming in many ways, but not set up for foreign students at that particular
Yeah.
point in history. But I think
Yeah.
going back to going to Asia, understanding, listening to people from that part of the world about what was important. And I think this goes in any discipline, in any part of the business world. And that's how you ultimately act as a consultant, as you can well imagine, listening to what was important to them And in Asia at that particular point in time, what was important was, first of all, the technical understanding of the industry, which was the telecommunications industry, what was happening in the industry, what opportunities were for their economies to grow due to telecommunications, but also the knowledge of what was happening in other parts of Asia. And those countries did not have access to each other. So the business language of Asia was English. So that was a huge advantage, actually, believe it or not. And so going from country to country, the dialects are so distinct in that part of the world that even if two people are speaking Chinese, they don't understand each other necessarily. But I was not only able to move freely from Taiwan to mainland China to Hong Kong or Thailand or wherever I was at the time, but I was accumulating knowledge about each place and what was going on. And they were very anxious. The Koreans want to know what's happening in Japan. At that time, information didn't flow. We didn't have the internet. Information didn't flow the way it flows today. And even the information we get today isn't necessarily always correct or true, the way we're getting our information. So I think understanding what's important to that audience, person, situation, organization that you're serving is the key to success in a lot of environments. Don't presume anything, but go learn and listen and then bring that knowledge back.
There's so much to unpack here, Jacqueline, and it is all about intentionality. It is about connecting with intention. And this is something that a lot of us women don't do. Although we're very good at connecting, we're not too good in building these networks, building alliances, and do that in a strategic way. And then also have the courage to activate them. Because very often we say, oh, we will not bother this person. I'm not sure if I can go there. Probably he or she won't have time for meetings like that. And I hear that at very young stage in your career, you are already building these networks, anticipating. You already had a mentor. This is something that a lot of us only think of when we're 40, 45, and we really start struggling. And it is, especially now, it is so much easier to do than it was in your time. Now we have LinkedIn. I know a couple of years ago, I was planning to go to the Emirates, right? To Dubai. And so on LinkedIn, I just started connecting with people from there and asking all relevant questions in order to prepare my stuff. And when I was there, I had a lot of meetings because all of these people were interested in what I had to bring. And I even had some workshops there from the second time I went there. So there's a lot that we can do if we can just show up, reach out, and bring those connections to a level where there is an interaction from I would say, from a point of a view of abundance, basically. And then the other thing is understand that different cultures need different approaches, sometimes different language, different behavior, but also curiosity. Like you say, listening, understanding what it is that they need, understanding what it is that their priorities are, not coming there, okay, this is how we did it in the US, or this is how we do things in Europe, and now let's just implement there, but really building these relationships and understanding how you can serve other people or organizations. And those things take intention and also time and energy that we don't always have because we are afraid that we might not show up as the professional knowing everything, which we can't. But we are so used, especially the higher the level we work on, that we are supposed to know our things, that we are afraid to ask. We are afraid to be curious. We are afraid to be open minded and just let things come in, even if they're completely different from what we know. And I think this is absolutely leadership and entrepreneurial strength that you are demonstrating there. Yeah. Beautiful story.
Thank you very much for that.
Yeah. So, what parts of your career made you who you are today?
Interesting. Obviously, or I have to say, it's not always just the successes. I think most of us that have been down this road for as many years as you and I have know that it's not just about success. And so I think Early on, when I first started, I was so much younger than everybody else. And I never saw that as a disadvantage. But when the people you're managing are older than your grandparents, they're not always very happy with you. So there were a few people that were really out to get me early on when I first, like literally within the first year of starting to work. And just putting my head down and doing what I was supposed to do, and then relying on the good people to help me get through that period. That was the first thing, head down. It happened to me again when I was up for the big promotion to go to Asia because I was up against people that had a lot more seniority than I was. Again, I was fortunate that I was in a unique position. But when I came back was when it really hit me because I was in a situation where there was somebody that was hired in between me and the boss that had sent me over there. And that person, actually, I remember she specifically said to me that she didn't like that I wore makeup and that my hair was too long and I needed to wear it back, and didn't like that I wore a red dress when I came to work, and all these things that had absolutely nothing to do with my skills. So that
Mm.
was another situation where I just had to take a deep breath and, just focus on what I was good at. And in the end, my sequence there was wrong. This was when I came back from doing my 6 months in Beijing, and I came back to my job before I was promoted and sent to Asia. And so the real learning there was that I stuck with my who I was and what I was good at. And in the end, she supported my promotion to the Far East. So that was a huge swing from somebody that took one look at me and said, "Oh, you're far too glamorous to do this kind of work." And I said, "What does that have to do with anything?" I always wore jewelry. I always had hair pieces and whatever. That's who I am. And I think you have to be true to yourself. You have to be professional, but you have to be true to who you are. Those are
Absolutely.
things that really taught me a lot, I think, along the way. And then dealing with people that had all kinds of preconceived biases. Those are inflection points in your career that are not necessarily from positive experiences. And
Yeah.
likewise, I think then jumping onto this huge opportunity in Asia was pivotal. I had to really grow fast in that job, and I had to put all my personal things aside because
Yeah.
over there, I was representing the company. And I think that's a huge learning curve. I couldn't take a chance of ever going to a party and not having all of my faculties at the end of a party. So it's a big deal to represent a major corporation overseas. So
Mm.
that's a big growth curve. The flip side is you come back from that opportunity and all of a sudden you're just a normal person again because it's quite privileged to work overseas as an expatriate, as you can well imagine. So when you come back, it's not like there's a big welcoming committee to say, "Oh, now you're so important and we really think differently about you." No, they still think you're that same person that left, and they stick you in a cubicle and you're starting all over again. You have to prove yourself again now in a new job.
Yeah.
It's a big transition.
What was the main reason for you to leave corporate life?
I think for me, it was a combination of things. First of all, most of my career was in New York City. That's where I wanted to live. And then we had this in 1993, the World Trade Center bombing in Manhattan. And it was the first one that nobody even remembers. It was very small. And we were working across the street from the World Trade Center at that time. And so that literally within 24 hours, the company said, "We're moving everybody to this office in New England, north of Boston, in a very small town." So that already was a huge change that I was willing to accept. But also, I was mostly working all the time, and I had a very limited personal life between going to graduate school at night when I was first working, and then all my jobs I never had a job description for most of my jobs. So they were always like taking up a big portion of my life. I didn't have a big personal life, so I thought, okay, maybe if I move to Boston, I'll actually start to have a social life. Something a little different. But it was a very different environment here than it was in New York. It wasn't the same kind of intensity and competitiveness. And so my career started to take a little bit of a back seat. I then, but then I had an opportunity to leave the company and go, but that's a different part of it. But when I moved here, the first part of that is I actually met my husband. So that was a big deal. I left Boston. I came to Cape Ann, where I live now, because I wanted to live on the water. I bought a house. And along with the house came this gentleman who I've been married to for 26 years. So that was probably the biggest inflection point for me in terms of rethinking what I needed to do from a work standpoint. And it didn't, because there was a little bit of a gap in there. I did go to Texas for a couple of years and come back. And so I think by that point, I had my 17 years in corporate America. I finally met somebody who was going to fill a different part of my life of who I was, somebody more creative and didn't compete with me in any way, but added to who I was. I think when you come up this path, and I'm sure other women would endorse this, you're not looking for somebody who's going to be just like you. You really want somebody who brings out a different side of you. And when I met my husband, Michael, who I adore, he just blew my mind. He came from such a different perspective on everything. And I felt that at that point I had earned the right to change course. And I think that's what it's about, right? It's
Wow.
really doing the hard work early on so you can make your choices when you need to make your choices. So whether you make those choices because you decide you want to have children or get married or live in a different place, when you build your, I go back to build your base. It's so basic
Mhm.
so that you have the flexibility to make the choices you want to make later on. And I was just very fortunate that I could walk away at that time. It was really hard ever anyway to come to reach the level I reached so early in my corporate career without having to do things that compromised necessarily who I was. I started to see things that I really didn't like in corporate America. And I also learned, it's a very interesting lesson. I watched a former CEO of the company who I had hosted in China early on in my career for one of his first trips to China, who was there were at least 50 people running around making sure that his wife had a hair dryer and whatever he needed at that time in 1986. All the minions were running around making his life perfect. And then I saw him after he retired come back on a consulting project for the government to that part of the world. When nobody knew who he was, there was no one to help him. He had to stay at a 3-star hotel. He's the nicest man in the world, but he was lost. And I said
Mhm.
to myself, the lesson in that is I don't want my personal identity to be this company, because the company
Mhm.
in the end is going to do whatever it needs to do to survive and give a return to its shareholders, and they aren't going to care what happens to me. And that's become more true, unfortunately, over the years. So I said
Yeah,
I need to be
absolutely.
a full person, and it's
Mm.
very hard sometimes to do that in a large corporation. They, at the time especially, maybe not so much now, but at the time, like, you just couldn't have a separate career, like a little practice on the side or whatever. It was always considered a conflict of interest with the company. And so it was really hard to be that whole person that we so value now in the workplace.
Yeah.
And so for me, it was like time. It was just time to go be me, whatever that me was. And I think that my husband was so different. It just helped me make that leap. I know it's a
Yeah.
crazy story, but that is the story. And that helped me open up a different side of my life.
It's not a crazy story. I think that somehow a lot of women can relate to that or recognize that we take our whole identity into our job. This is who we
Hmm.
are. We are the CFO or we are the VP or the this is who we are. While we are so many other things, or at least the potential
Hmm.
to be so many other things is there. But organizations are so consuming, they are consuming, energy consuming, they're really consuming that we basically we don't put boundaries there, we don't put limits, we don't push back and
Right.
say I'm also other things. My identity is not only my organization. And
Right.
so if you have the situation like you just told, that you
Mm.
met somebody that kind of helped you open up completely different aspects of your life, where you started understanding that these were also very important and relevant to you, then I believe a lot of us can resonate with that, or at least be a little bit triggered to
Mhm.
that work for me. Because then
Yeah.
you also started your artistic
Right.
part of
And
your
that
life.
that brings out
How
that
is
brings
that?
up something even that's another one of those kind of key blocks that we were talking about, which is community. So one
Mm,
of the things that's really hard to experience when you're in your corporate mode is the place you live, right? How much time do you have left at the end of the day, at the end of the week, to care about what's happening around you in other things? People get on boards of nonprofits, but they might be giving some expertise, but to really live the gift for me after all the craziness of having to move here was finding a true community of a really diverse place with a lot of opportunity to help other people learn about life in a different way. This is an old fishing community where I live, and a very old arts community. So it's really hard to live here without having all that sort of infuse into who you are and be part of it.
yeah.
And meeting my husband was one of the anchors, but also finding a place where you could actually really make a contribution in a different way. And yes, and so I reconnected with a creative side that was really dormant, again, that was killed in the corporate world. Even when I was the director of advertising, working in large agencies in New York City, they didn't really care what I thought creatively. They cared that what we were doing was on strategy. But creatively, they had experts. And so my creative side went into dormancy. But anyway, still, my business side guided my creative side, right? I'm still more on that side of the brain.
Yeah.
And that's where I found this little niche
Mm,
in the world of sea glass, which I wouldn't have even known what that was at the time. But it goes back to, again, a fundamental teaching of my dad when I was growing up, which is if you're going to start something new, try to find an area that most people are not thinking about. And I use
mm,
this in everything I did. I used it when I wrote my master's thesis in my thesis in college and my master's thesis. I always tried to find areas that other people were not paying attention to. So it gives you a chance to at least get something going, right?
mm,
That little niche. And so that little niche for me was hair accessories, which were inspired by a lot of what I saw in Europe, and working specifically with sea glass, which is indigenous to this area, and then finding new ways to work with it over time. And now, 22 years later, I actually have a
mm.
business in that area that my
And,
husband loves, which is really fun because he really didn't care much about marketing or business. And I still have that business, and that's still very important to me. Working with companies on research and new market development. I love that. It inspires me.
mm,
This also inspires me in a very different way.
yeah. And it is like interacting, isn't it? How amazing is that? I have the same experience. My
Mm,
creativity now I can do in my garden and with my vegetables and with everything that I produce and create here on the land. And it
mhm.
brings me this grounding and this
Yeah.
presence to do my work with women. And so it
Mhm.
is constantly interacting. It is not competing. It is not conflicting. It is
Yeah.
absolutely interacting. And that's another thing that a lot of us don't understand. And it
Mm.
is that we can like embrace paradoxes and embrace
Yeah.
different things. Because when I work in my garden, you don't want to see my
Mm.
nails, right?
Yeah.
And
No, or mine
you
for that matter.
and then you dress up for
Yes.
your conversations, for the coaching sessions, for the
Right.
online trainings or whatever, or you travel
Mm.
to wherever in order to deliver workshops or whatever. And you're two people, but you're not. And
Mm.
especially not when you are open about this, because some of us, we even hide these little things because we feel that if we bring in our profession, if we bring something that is not professional, it will
Right.
have an impact on our credibility, on our authority. And I said, no, because you can use elements and wisdom and expertise
Mm.
from other parts of your life
Yeah.
to bring them into your professional
Yeah.
life as metaphors, as examples. Everything is transferable, everything is
Yeah.
interconnected. And I love having these conversations like with women
Mhm.
like you who are whole women, who are not just the professional or just the mother or just who
Yeah.
have all these things integrated and are not afraid of talking about that without being seen of considering themselves as not professional, because you're talking about glass jewelry or your love for
Mhm.
hair pieces or my love for organic olive oil or whatever, or for my dog. It doesn't make me less professional. It
Right.
makes me
No.
more human. It makes me more
And
woman.
and the truth is, Helena, that if you go to a cocktail party, nobody wants to talk about marketing. Okay. Everybody wants to talk about jewelry and the arts and all these wonderful
Of
things. And
course.
so this was the ticket for me to enter this incredible arts community here and also make a huge difference. And I was
Yeah.
able to apply all my entrepreneurial and collaboration, which is really my specialty anyways, bringing people together, bringing organizations together to create things that had never been created before, like a wearable art runway show, which blew everybody's mind. And it was the same elements that you would need for any major partnership that you did in the business world. And I brought universities together and museums together and all these groups together. And it's the same discipline. And I have to say, my advice to the people in the arts world is to learn to bring some of these skills into their work because it will help them tremendously. And my advice to people in the business world is to really pay attention to the way artists think, because there is some incredible creative problem solving that goes on in the arts that is really, you learn so much from it. And I interviewed for a program that we did locally with my best friend here, 75 artists during, it started during COVID to help keep the arts community alive, doing this kind of interview and storytelling. And I was blown away. I'm just a novice compared to all these folks that have been doing art their whole life, with how they have found in a unique piece of the creative spectrum, each and every single one of them, which is a very hard thing to do with all the great artists in the world.
Yeah.
So I learned a lot from them. I learned a lot from them.
Beautiful. As I say, everything is interconnected and we tend to
Mhm.
separate things. But as you say, artistic creativity can have a huge impact and benefit if you apply it on business challenges. And I would say vice versa. Absolutely. Jacqueline, what is like the best piece of advice that you would like to share with our audience and that you wish that you had known 15 years earlier?
Oh, that's the second half is the hardest part of that question, actually. I'd known earlier. Maybe it's hard for me to say that I didn't know earlier because I felt like people gave me a lot of really good advice early on and that I was able to use throughout my years. But that's a good one. I think for me, it was to start some of these things earlier, even the relationships part, to do it intentionally. It's never too early to start that. So that's one piece of advice that I would give. I think the other piece would be to shore up all those pieces of your career. Like I was hesitant to do too much, for example, in finance. It wasn't really my thing, but I do think that's a really good discipline for people to have in their back pocket. You have to do it in business school, and that's fine. But I do think that having those kinds of things going into your career is super important. Not be afraid at all of the financial side of things and really learn it, learn how to budget, learn how to do all that. Again, you do it, but learning it and making an early part of what you do, I think is very important. I don't know. I've been really fortunate. I think I paid attention to a lot of the advice that I was given along the way. And it's only a question of how much risk you want to take to
Yeah.
decide how far you're going to go.
How do you
And
define?
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Jacqueline, this conversation was full of gold, full of nuggets. I am
thank you.
absolutely sure. I cannot even recap. It would take another 15 minutes, but I'm so sure that our audience can listen and listen again. I will make sure that all the connection information, how people can connect with you and find out more
Mhm.
about all the beautiful things that you do, that this is mentioned in the show notes. So go
Thank
there
you.
if you want to connect with Jacqueline. If you want to see her absolutely stunning, beautiful jewelry. It is amazing. So just have a look and see the beauty of combining business and now consultancy with art, and how that can come together, and how that might be something also for you to discover and explore. And as always, I am wishing everybody listening in here a lot of inspiration and encouragement, and see how you can apply some of these beautiful stories and beautiful learnings on your own life, because every day is a new day full of opportunities. Every day is a day that you can set intentions, and this is our power. This is how we show up. This is also how we are role models for our children, our grandchildren, our communities, our teams. Wherever you have impact, it is so important that you can show up every day in a way that is renewed and energized and inspired. It's so much fun. Thank you so much, Jacqueline. I am a
And
fan.
I want to say thank you. And while we're on the topic of thank yous, I do think we have to teach our next generation to write thank you notes and acknowledge the people that have helped them along the way in any way they can. It's just one of those
Mm.
wonderful ways that we can constantly give back and acknowledge the people that have helped us get to where we are today.
Absolutely beautiful. Thank you so much, Jacqueline, for being here, for contributing to the Boundary Breakers Collective. I am so humbled and happy to have you here on our show. And I'm sure that there's a bright future in front of all of us, and hopefully with a lot of jewelry and things with hair,
That's
because
right.
that's fun, isn't it? Thank you so much. Thanks for being with us. Check our other episodes. If you like this episode, if it gave value to you, then just like it or comment to it, connect with us. Whatever makes you progress in this area of female leadership reinvented, you are so welcome to connect with us and give us your feedback or ask your questions. Bye for now and see you later. Take care.